Next up, let's get this coupling gear for the shutter release in place. So I'll just put some synthetic grease in the centre where it slides over the shaft, some round the outside where it runs in this bush, usually just a wipe on the front there where the shroud supports it. Now can we get that coupled to the gear? Got to get that on that shaft. It's on. And this little chrome shroud goes over that, holds it all in position. I'll get that screw in at the top. And the screw in at the bottom will hold that shutter release mechanism down out of the way so I can see what I'm about. You're still in the picture only just. I think this would make much better videos if I had transparent fingers. And that's screwed down lightly. Right, normally I push back on this with my thumb to push it out against the screws. That makes sure that the focus scale ring doesn't rub on the inside of that piece. So it's nice and smooth in its operation. And you can see the rod comes through the front of that. That's good. Well, I think I'll put the rewind back together and get that on the camera. Here's the inner piece. It has a little detent spring on it that stops it flopping about. I'll put a bit of synthetic grease on there. This goes in. It only goes in one way up because that tab that you see on the end there has to line up with the groove in the outer piece. There we go. Well, that's so keen to run away today. Yes, must have suddenly developed a lean. Here's the bush that holds it all in place. And here I'm using some synthetic grease. But if the surfaces are quite rubbed from having grit or sand in there for some length of time, graphite grease does a better job here. But it's messier. So I use it when I need to, ignore it when I don't. That moves fine. I'll get that on the body. Three screws. Exactly the same as the ones on the tripod socket that we haven't fitted yet. And the top of the film advance, the bush that holds the top of the film advance. Also you have screws of the same type. Now those screws were just very slightly loose when I took the camera apart. That's that piece. Next, I think, film advance. Okay, let's carry on with this reassembly. The film advance shaft here I'm lubricating with graphite grease. So I just like the way this stuff sticks to the shaft. Quite tenacious. I'll just do the spring on here while I'm at it. That's just so that the coils of the spring roll over each other without any argument. Okay, so there's the shaft. Let's take the take-up spool, pop that in there. There's a bush. A nickel-plated bush goes in the base of that take-up spool. Film advance shaft will drop down into there. Not that it makes a great deal of difference, but by convention the slot on this piece goes to the end of that housing. I think it's about there. Let's see if I can just check what's happening here. Yeah, there it is. Yeah, this Retina IIa is not one of the earliest manufacture, and as a result it has a cross-shaped piece on the bottom of the film advance shaft here, which hits the lever that holds the take up the rewind button down, and it just releases it. So as soon as you move the film advance lever, it swings around. One of these lobes hits the lever that's here, and releases it. Okay, so here's our release for the, or the lock if you like, for the rewind button. I'll just put a wipe of molybdenum paste on the tip of that. Now, usually I'll just run some round through the hole in the middle for good measure. Not because it needs to be molybdenum paste for that job, it's just that it's in my hand. And it's as good a lubricant as anything else. Now there's a shoulder screw here. It goes through the spring, through the lever, and into the body. You need to centre everything up so that the spring revolves freely round the screw head and the lever revolves freely round the shoulder on the screw. I'm just checking it moves. It seems a bit tight. I wonder if it's a little bit bent. I'll tighten that screw down and just check that. I just cheated there and I just bent it up slightly at the tip. That was enough to make sure it moves freely. In an ideal world you'd probably replace that with a new shiny one, but that ideal world no longer exists. Right, so there we have it, and there's its return spring in place, and as the film advance shaft rotates you'll see it hits that lever. This of course would be held back about here somewhere, and it releases it, swings it round and releases it. Well, with that done, I think I can put the sprocket shaft in place. So here's my sprocket. And the sprocket shaft I'll lubricate with a little bit of synthetic grease. Up near the top where it's going to go through the body casting, down at the bottom where it's going to go through the body casting. Normally I just put a little bit on the pinion on the top for good measure. It slides down from the top, through the sprocket, If I can get it lined up. And there's a screw hole at the top here that little screw actually drives that sprocket on the shaft. In other words, as the shaft revolves, the screw drives the sprocket. A bit reluctant to start. It was a bit reluctant to come out, that screw. It might be slightly damaged. Let's try it 180 degrees out. Might be a better lead on this face of the hole in the shaft. Yes, there is. Started straight away, no arguments. Making sure that revolves smoothly, it appears to. The rewind button next. The rewind button's here, it has a washer, it has a spring. Usually have the spring white with some synthetic grease, put it on the button, put the washer on the button, and that screws in to the sprocket shaft at the base of the camera. I'll pull that lever back, check that it clicks in, check that it releases. It appears good. I'll tighten that, check that it clicks in, and you'll see that as this lever revolves, it pushes on this and releases it and unlocks that. So that's good. That part went smoothly. Here we have the tripod socket. There are 3 screws here. You can usually tell which ones they are because they've very often got the remains of the adhesive still embedded in the slots. These ones certainly do, even after they've been cleaned. The tripod socket screws were slightly loose. When we took the camera apart, that is entirely normal. They're all in place. Run them down. Do them up tight. The surround or shield for the rewind button has little raised sides on it so you don't accidentally depress the button. The earliest cameras didn't have that, so if you banged the camera down on a firm surface, it would press that rewind button in, and suddenly things weren't happening that you expected to happen. Let's get those 2 screws in place. That's good. That leather I'll glue back shortly. What's our next move here? I think it's to do the film advance component still. And here I want to do the clutch assembly. Well, the clutch assembly's job is to provide some controlled slippage between the sprocket shaft and the take-up spool. If there was no slippage there, then as the film built up on the take-up spool, eventually, well, the diameter builds up. As the diameter builds up, it'll be pulling film through faster and faster compared to the sprocket shaft, which would be at a fixed rate. And so the film would get torn to pieces. So by allowing for some slippage in the take-up spool, you don't get that problem. I'm just going to grip this with a pair of crimp lug pliers, rotate that to pull that spring into place, drop that over the top, there we have it. There's our clutch assembly. The slippage feels good. And that drops in here. Engages with slot in the top of the take-up spool. And here's the guide bush for the film advance shaft. Need to force some grease into these two little pinion sets, as these have all been cleaned with the ultrasonic cleaner. There's no lubrication left in there at all. And this sits over the top. If I rotate the sprocket shaft, you can see this gear set moving. If I rotate the take-up spool, you can see this gear set moving. This is held in place with 3 screws. Excuse me. Let's get these 3 screws in place. Do those up very lightly. I'm going to make sure that these gear sets are all engaged and running smoothly. This camera was somewhat crippled when I started, so I need to make sure that stuff actually moves freely. That looks okay to me. Do those 3 screws up and check that again. That looks good. Well, more film advance stuff to be done after that. Well, we'll start with the gear here that links the sprocket shaft and take-up spool together. Make sure that drops into place. Yeah, make sure it revolves smoothly. It does. That looks good. Where'd that go? Fell in there. Don't want that. That little drive dog goes on there. That spring goes on the top. I know from experience that probably starting the film advance shaft about that position, that notch pointing out this way, would probably give me good return tension on the rewind, on the film advance. There's a ratchet needs to go excuse me, go in here, which I haven't put in place yet. Better get that seated in. The ratchet pull here. I'll get that screw. Has a spring on the shaft. The shoulder on the screw has to pass through that lever and through that standoff underneath it too, so that everything moves smoothly. That spring in place, sitting in its groove. Now it is. Okay, so with that ratchet it means that this stuff will only move in one direction. That's good. A wipe of molybdenum paste here. That spring drops down there. There are 2 coil springs that look much the same. The smaller diameter one ends up at the top of the camera. The larger diameter one goes down that hole. Just checking that moves up and down freely, and it appears to. This bracket that holds everything in place needs some grease on there. So I'm using synthetic grease, just forcing a little bit in there. This holds everything in place. Is that catching on? That's better. Now there are 3 screws, 2 plain ones, one drops down the back here. It's awkward to get at. Let's try getting its mate down there and then come back and tip that one out. Not today. Cover those 2 screws and I'll get one of them fitted in place. Why is that thing not pressing down? That's better. One of these screws goes at the end here. Run that in lightly. The other one drops down in here, and as I said, it's awkward to get in place. You haven't got enough room to hold it neatly with your tweezers and manoeuvre it. That time it dropped in for me. It doesn't normally drop in for me. At the front here there's a special spring. It's a funny shaped thing. There's all sorts of odd angles on it. Don't start squaring it up thinking that would be a clever thing to do. It's supposed to be a funny shaped spring. Make sure that revolves freely around that shoulder on that screw. Seems a bit tight there at the moment. That's okay. Hold this lever down, lift that spring over the top and behind it. That looks good. The 3 screws now, the one with the spring on it and the other 2, can be tightened up. There's a gear on the top of the film advance shaft right here. I'll just put a little smear of grease on there for good measure. Goes on that squared shaft. Meshes with that other gear on this plate. And on top of that there's a spacer. And if we had the film advance lever we could check the motion of this. Now I'm going to depress this piece, advance that 1 full turn I think. Something seems very tight here, I'm not sure why that is. Yeah, something's running rough. Yeah, this plate's not sitting correctly. Let's just slacken those screws off. That's better. Right, let's hold that out, swing that right round to there. If this lever was on there in the rest position, I've just tensioned that. I'll press down that button, I can rotate this back where we were. That lever on there, press that down, I can revolve this, it would revolve through half a turn and then return to the rest position. It seems to run smoothly and there's no undue tension there. Next, a cocking rack I think. Well, I'll lubricate this with a little bit of synthetic grease. It feeds in from this end. Bring this right round till it clicks, go a little bit further, feed that rack in. That's not moving back to the rest position correctly there. Something's not right. there may be some roughness with that rack. We know that the rack was out of place and there was some mystery problem with this earlier. It's coming back to the rest position. And drop the rack. With one tooth out. That's about the right placement. There's a slight catch in that mechanism. I'm not sure where it's coming from. I'll assemble the whole frame counter component on the top there and check the motion. It may well be that I just don't have enough downward pressure on the top here, and that's why it's catching. Here is our frame counter spring or pawl. Get that in there. Goes in that hole. Assemble the rest of this frame counter. As you start with this piece, apply a bit of grease to that. This piece goes over the top. That grease helps stick it in place. The disc with the numbers on it, I usually do the same with that. Just put a touch of grease on there and it helps stick this together while I'm assembling it. As I said earlier, there's a scratch on here that points towards number 1. There it is. Here's the top of the counter mechanism, so that goes through the centre. Here's the wavy washer. I seem to have an excess amount of grease on that pair of tweezers. There's the screw that's going to hold it, and there should be a star washer that goes on that, and there it is. So I should be able to screw that into place.